Is okay with you? So welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. Extensive market research has shown us that you get a good crowd if you include either the word manifesto or sex in the title. And manifesto was last week, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Katharine Park as this year's Lionel Trilling seminar speaker to talk about rethinking the one-sex body, sex, gender and medicine in medieval and early modern Europe. A word very briefly about the Lionel Trilling seminar, which antedates the creation of the Hyman Center. We took it over about a decade ago. It was founded the year after Lionel Trilling died. And as many of you will know, Lionel Trilling was a illustrious member of the Columbia Humanities faculty for much of the mid-20th century. His association with Columbia started in the early 1920s, and he got his doctorate, I think, here, and joined the faculty and rose through the ranks to become full professor in the English department in 1948. And simultaneously with the well-known critical work that he produced on Matthew Arnold and others, he also became the epitome of the Cold War era New York intellectual through his association with Partisan Review in particular. And his writings about the importance of the, bless you, of the imagination on politics and the importance of culture have lasted well beyond the end of the Cold War era that formed him, and have inspired us in choosing a succession of speakers for the Lionel Trilling seminar, of which Professor Park is the latest. So thank you very much for coming. Professor Park is closely associated almost from birth with Harvard, as far as I can tell. She took her BA at Radcliffe, bravely went to the Warburg for a master's, and then returned to Harvard to get a doctorate in the history of science. Taught at Wellesley College for the best part of 17 years before returning to Harvard in 1997, where she now has, sorry, I can't remember this, the Samuel Zemurray Jr. and Doris Zemurray Stone Radcliffe Professorship in the history of science. She will be known to those of you in particular who are interested in history of science in the Renaissance for her two books, one of which was a study of medicine in early Renaissance Florence, and which I would say was an early pioneer in the focus that has now become so important in looking at the relationship between artisanal knowledge and practices and what we think of as scientific innovation and discovery. And then in 2006, Secrets of Women, Gender, Generation, and the Origins of Human Dissection, which looked similarly at the ways in which the practice of embalming bodies and preparing bodies for death gave rise to what would become kind of scientific knowledge. Tonight she is going to revisit the arguments of Walter Laqueur that he made in an important book in 1990. She will speak for about 45 minutes, and then our two respondents, Professor Joel Kay and Professor Pamela Smith, will respond, and then, if we're lucky, there will be time for some thoughts and questions from the floor. So, Professor Park, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and I'm very honored to be invited to this seminar. Next year, Making Sex will be 25 years old. Published in 1990, Thomas Laqueur's book has given rise to a large and lively conversation among scholars across the humanistic disciplines. Laqueur's history of body and gender from the Greeks to Freud, in truth, mostly a history of medical ideas of sex difference, is organized around a narrative with a single point of inflection. In the years around 1800, a breakpoint taken over from Michel Foucault. In the English language edition of Hercule Barbin, Foucault wrote that it was only in the late 18th century that European medical, legal, and political authorities came to insist that people have one and only one true sex. Before then, he claimed, it was believed that a single body could accommodate a mixture of sexes, as in the case of hermaphrodites. Laqueur reframed this tradition as a shift from a one-sex to a two-sex body. In the latter, modern body, the two sexes were opposite and complementary. Before then, however, he said, the modern question about the real sex of a person made no sense, not because the two sexes were mixed, that was Foucault's contention, but because there was only one to pick from and it had to be shared by everyone. That sex was male. The unity Laqueur attributed to the one-sex body had both anatomical and physiological elements. He began by laying out the anatomy of the one-sex body in a much-quoted passage. For thousands of years, it had been a commonplace that women had the same genitals as men, except that, as Nemesius, bishop of Emesa in the 4th century, put it, theirs are inside the body and not outside it. In particular, the prolific 2nd century medical writer Galen had argued, quote, women were essentially men in whom a lack of vital heat of perfection had resulted in the retention inside of structures that in the male are visible without. In this world, Laqueur concluded, the vagina is imagined as an interior penis, the labia as foreskin, the uterus as scrotum, and the ovaries as testicles. His reference in Galen is to a passage in Book 14 of On the Use of Parts, Galen's long treatise on anatomy and physiology. And this is the quotation. You can see that the emphasis is on the sort of the folding inward and then turning outward of the female and male genitals, respectively. While the icon of this theory has become the famous woodcut of the uterus and vagina in On the Fabric of the Human Body of Andreas Vesalius, the illustration that expresses this idea most explicitly appears in an anatomy treatise published 20 years earlier. And this was the brief introduction to anatomy by the Italian surgeon and anatomist Jacopo Berengario of Carpi. The three figures of the uterus in this woodcut, and all three of those are of the uterus, demonstrate the essential features of the genital homologies enumerated by Laqueur. The Latin captions direct our attention to the vagina and labia, pudendum in Latin, which resemble the penis and foreskin, and to what Berengario calls, and this is on the top image, the testicles, our ovaries, which have obvious counterparts in male anatomy. The central figure illustrates Laqueur's fourth homology between the scrotum and the uterus, with which its punctiform cotyledons has been designed to resemble the scrotal sac here. Berengario's use of inverted in the caption to this figure signals his familiarity with the inside-out relationship between the male and female genitals described by Galen. The only elements without counterparts in the male genitals in this image are the horn-shaped ligaments that prevent the uterus from wandering, a piece of Hippocratic gynecology explicitly rejected by Galen. You can see there at the bottom, but each of the top and the bottom uteruses have them. And the long horizontal strips, mislabeled, as it turns out, as spermatic vessels. This caption must represent a confusion on the part of the illustrator, as the real spermatic vessels, there, were the short curved ducts through which seed was released into the uterus during orgasm, a situation with a direct parallel in male anatomy, where the spermatic vessels ran from the testicles to the penis. The longer, straighter vessels in the woodcut must therefore be the veins that carried the blood from the uterus to the breasts of lactating women to be refined into milk. As Laqueur emphasized, the anatomy of the organs reflected their physiological functions. Laqueur's discussion of the physiology of the one-sex body centered on the complexional difference between men, hot, and women, cool, and what he called the fungibility or interconvertibility of fluids whose flows and intertransformations were basic to the functions of the body. Food was transformed into blood, which was refined and transformed in the internal organs of the body. The fluid matter of the body had also to be continuously evacuated to make room for more. In addition to feces and urine, it could be elaborated into seed in both men and women, and into the beard and body hair in men. Furthermore, because women were cooler and less efficient in processing blood, this blood needed to be evacuated in the form of menses. In the case of women who were pregnant or lactating, menstruation stopped and the excess blood went to nourish the fetus in the uterus, or was refined instead into milk in the breasts, as we've already seen. In men of an unhealthily cool temperament, it might be evacuated through hemorrhoidal bleeding or nosebleeds. Laqueur presented these flows and their interconvertibility as central to the one-sex body. In his words, what matters is losing blood in relation to the fluid balance of the body, not the sex of the subject or the orifice from which it is lost. For example, men of sufficiently cold complexion could lactate and menstruate, I would add, while complexionally hot women might grow beards. Attempts to evaluate Laqueur's account of the one-sex body have been complicated by his failure to define clearly and precisely the elements necessary and sufficient to establish its presence in any given text. On the contrary, he identified as theorists of the one-sex body authors who differed dramatically on key elements. For example, Galen believed that women, like men, produced seed that was essential to the reproductive process, while Aristotle, whom Laqueur also identified as a supporter of the one-sex body, denied it. Galen presented his understanding of genital homology as a completion, but also a strong critique of Aristotle's discussion of female imperfection. By the same token, Aristotle gave no indication that he understood men's and women's genitals as homologous and inverted versions of one another, and he explicitly denied the existence of efficacious female seed. His argument also precluded the transformation of women into men. To my knowledge, Galen never pronounced on the matter of sex change. Rather, later Latin medical writers plucked those stories from Book 7 of Pliny's Natural History, where they were divorced from any account of genital anatomy or physiology. Instead, Pliny mentioned hermaphrodites as part of a discussion of omens and monstrous births, followed by 4 examples of women who turned into men. Finally, Laqueur also identified Hippocrates as a proponent of the one-sex body, flying in the face of the Hippocratic treatises on gynecology, which presented women's bodies as so different from men's that their medical care could not be discussed in the same books. I will try to introduce some consistency into Laqueur's discussion, or at least my discussion of Laqueur's discussion, by establishing clear criteria for the presence of the one-sex body, or lack thereof, in any given text, restricting it to the 3 aspects of the one-sex body most consistently invoked by Laqueur. 1, the idea of the complexional continuum, men and women arrayed along a continuous spectrum of hot and cold. 2, the idea that the male and female genitals are inverted and homologous versions of one another, though ultimately I had to dilute that criterion because its proponents were so few and it would have been a very, very short talk. My 3rd criterion is the necessity of female seed for generation. Beyond these, 2 other elements may be present: the existence of real hermaphrodites occupying the center of the complexional spectrum, and the possibility that women may turn into men, but neither of these last 2 features appears to be essential. Finally, the one-sex body should be distinguished from 2 other beliefs concerning sex difference, with which it is sometimes confused. One is the idea that the male body is the generic human body, created prior to the female body and serving as its model, as in the description of the creation of Eve in the second chapter of Genesis. This idea was universally accepted in medieval Christian Europe, as was its obvious consequence that accounts of human anatomy could focus on the male prototype, except where the female genitals were concerned. The second belief that shouldn't be confused with the one-sex body was the idea derived from Aristotle that females were mutilated males incapable of producing fertile seed. Aristotle's position was clearly incompatible with the one-sex body as I have defined it, while invocation of Eve's creation out of Adam's body was not. However, both were quite distinct from the one-sex body logically and historically. It was perfectly possible to understand the male body as prior, superior, and generically human without assuming that the principal difference between male and female bodies lay in the homological and inverted relationship between their genitals, let alone that the boundary between the sexes was blurred or unstable, or that under the right circumstances women could turn into men. Laqueur's assertion of the hegemony of the one-sex body in pre-Enlightenment Europe has elicited responses across a range of disciplines. It has been embraced by some scholars in literary and cultural studies, and students tell me that it is presented as established fact in at least one course on women's history at Harvard. It has also been questioned or rejected, especially by feminist critics, for its effacement of women and female sexuality. Tonight, however, I will focus on its reception by historians of early medicine, who are in many respects the scholars best positioned to assess it, for despite the broad cultural implications of Laqueur's argument, he framed it in terms of the history of medicine and grounded it fairly narrowly in the evidence of medical texts, images, and ideas. I find it odd that historians of early medicine with strong views on the topic, among whom I include myself, have not weighed in earlier and more audibly. When we have written about Laqueur's thesis, generally to question or critique it, we have done so in a few paragraphs or pages in a longer book or article devoted to a more general topic, such as the history of anatomy or theories of sex difference. And I'm going to just show you the title page or the covers of 4 monographs that lay out information critical to assessing the validity of Laqueur's argument. And you can see that they begin almost immediately after Laqueur's book was published, although Joan Cadden's book had long been in the making. So Rebecca Fleming. So Joan Cadden works on medieval Latin medical history, but also in the context of natural philosophy and theology. Rebecca Fleming on Roman medical theory, culminating in Galen. And my book on human dissection, and Monica Green's book on the healthcare of women in the later Middle Ages. And all of these books comment in some detail on Laqueur, but as I say, you would never guess it by looking at their covers. The only historians of early medicine to have addressed the problem head-on in monographic publications have been Michael Stolberg, a historian of early modern European medicine, and Helen King, a historian of the Hippocratic tradition, ancient and early modern. Rather than challenging Laqueur's one-sex, two-sex narrative wholesale, Stolberg proposed a relatively small adjustment in its periodization, pointing out that the first known image of an explicitly female skeleton had been published in 1583 by the Swiss physician Felix Plater, rather than in 1759 as claimed by Laqueur. Accordingly, Stolberg proposed shifting the breakpoint between the one-sex and two-sex bodies from the late 18th to the late 16th century. And this is the image, and of course the argument, Laqueur's argument, based on the work of Londa Schiebinger, was that you couldn't have a female skeleton until you had a two-sex body, because this involved difference, anatomical and physiological difference, that was outside the genitals, where everything else was supposed to be the same. Stolberg's suggestion about reperiodization was not well received by either Laqueur or Londa Schiebinger, on whose imperfect research Laqueur had based his claim about the female skeleton. And their blistering and defensive responses prodded historians of early medicine to organize a series of small workshops and colloquia on the topic, and there were 2 of them at the Berkshire Conference, Women's Historians. But only Helen King went on to address Laqueur's thesis in publications that identified it clearly as their target. An article from 2005 and a book published just last year, The One-Sex Body on Trial, The Classical and Early Modern Evidence, which I heartily recommend. And I should say that she also said there was a significant shift in the late 16th century, so in some respects she accords with Stolberg's vision of the late 16th century as a kind of watershed, although not necessarily in the same way it was for Laqueur. While King's learned and imaginative book dismantles Laqueur's argument, it discusses only the ancient and early modern periods, as the title indicates, with a strong emphasis on Western European textual production, as was indeed the case for Laqueur. Like Laqueur, she leaves largely unaddressed the 1300 years between Galen in the 2nd century and Berengario of Carpi, whose image of the uterus I discussed earlier. Without that large missing piece between the 2nd and the 16th centuries, our narrative regarding the evolution of Western ideas of sex difference is seriously incomplete. So you can see here the yellow bit is what I'm going to be trying to fill in, and Monica Green and Helen King, to some extent, only insofar as she addresses Byzantine materials, has done a little bit for the kind of the gap period. So now we have more or less complete narrative, but it's in multiple articles, books. Nobody has really put it together. So I decided that's what I was going to do. So my goal for the rest of this talk is to present a bird's eye view of changing understandings of sex difference in the Middle Ages through the 16th century, with special reference to the one-sex body, based partly on my own research and partly on that of other historians of medieval and early modern science and medicine. I have stitched together their work to create a brief narrative based on what I consider to be the best scholarship on the topic. This narrative differs in important respects from Laqueur's, the product of a quarter century of specialized scholarship, which wouldn't have existed without his book opening up the question. It's predictably more comprehensive. Additionally, however, it is rooted in the social and professional history of pre-modern Western medicine, and it shows that medical writers' investment in a one-sex body, or lack thereof, was not based solely on the study of human cadavers or ancient texts. Rather, it reflected doctors' practical and professional aspirations and was, in particular, tightly bound up with the history of women's health care. Finally, a comment on geography. Although Laqueur's and King's discussions have a Western European focus, the history of ideas of sex difference in the Western medical tradition, rooted in the works of ancient Greek medical writers, is to be found in texts in Greek, Latin, Arabic, and Hebrew, produced by pagan, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars. In this sense, medical scholarship in Cairo, Baghdad, and Persia, and I guess Cordoba also, was no more non-Western than medical scholarship in Paris or Bologna. The Arabic tradition was particularly important for the history of the one-sex body, since the elements of Galen's account found earlier and better purchased there than in Latin medical texts. Medical writers in these different religious and linguistic traditions did not always agree with one another, especially where scientific and medical ideas of the female body bumped up against confessional practices. But such points of disagreement were relatively rare, given the huge range of topics embraced by medieval anatomy, physiology, theories of illness, and therapeutics. In the fields of gender and sexuality, the bones of contention related mostly to the acceptance of non-normative sexualities, the management of menstruation, and acceptance or rejection of techniques of fertility limitation. For the most part, the intellectual structures I will be describing were broadly shared across the lands that stretched from Persia to Spain and from North Africa to Scandinavia and the British Isles. I will preface my historical sketch with 4 premises or simplifying moves, without which we would be here all night. First, and this may already seem obvious, no single medical understanding of sex difference dominated the entire period that I'll be discussing. Throughout, there were multiple competing theories and traditions, depending on which Greek medical and scientific works were available to scholars and how they were interpreted, singly and in relation to one another. This is the unanimous opinion of all of the historians whose work I've described above. Oops, here it is. Second, the one-sex body, as I've defined it, was Galenic. Laqueur's attribution of it to the Hippocratic writers and Aristotle is mistaken. Both emphasize the radical differences between male and female bodies. Rather, as Laqueur himself acknowledged, the most eloquent and influential description of the homology of the male and female genitals appears in Galen's On the Use of Parts, which I quoted above, though it can also be found in Galen's treatises on seed and on natural faculties. Third, with apologies to any early modern literary historians in the audience, I will not be addressing the vernacular tradition. During the period I'll be discussing, the Galenic understanding of sex difference belonged to learned medical culture. If you are inclined to believe, as Laqueur claimed, that, quote, Galen spoke easily in various vernacular languages to the artisans and merchants, the midwives and barber surgeons of Renaissance and Reformation Europe, you should keep in mind that Galen did not speak easily in any language whatsoever to learned medical men. Very few physicians read much Galen in Latin, let alone in Greek. His oeuvre was far too large and complicated for medical students, let alone surgeons and barbers. As late as the 16th century, when printing began to make his works more accessible, most physicians still got their Galen through encyclopedias, compendia, textbooks. Whoops. Sorry. Forget that. We'll come to there. They got their Galen through encyclopedias, compendia, textbooks, and abbreviations, many Arabic in origin. I heartily encourage the informed and systematic study of the filtering of Galenic anatomy and physiology into early modern vernacular writing. Relevant texts include broadsheets, flap anatomies, anatomical and surgical compendia written for a non-Latin audience, and popular compilations like Aristotle's masterpiece. While a great deal of important work has been done on this topic, Laqueur's theory about the one-sex body has had a distorting influence, as a lot of the scholarship has been aimed at upholding or discrediting it, rather than examining the sources in their own right. Finally, we get to 4. The composition and transmission of learned medical treatises, whether in Greek antiquity, Latin Europe, or the Islamic world, cannot be divorced from the practice of medicine. With few exceptions, for example, the 11th century Persian polymath Ibn Sina, authors of medical works were not only scholars, but also practitioners involved in day-to-day interactions with patients. They incorporated their own experiences as healers into their medical works, highlighting or suppressing elements of the tradition according to what they observed in their own practice. Also, and this is central to the understanding of the one-sex body, learned practitioners who worked in the highly competitive marketplaces of Mediterranean, Middle Eastern, and Western European cities were always striving to defend and expand their claims to competence and authority, particularly with regard to less learned and less pricey competitors. In the case of gendered illnesses, these included, depending on time and place, physicians and empirical surgeons, male and female, and midwives. In this practical context, claims that women's and men's bodies were essentially similar, suffering from the same illnesses and demanding the same treatments, played into the hands of practitioners, principally physicians, who could claim competence in all sorts of illnesses, including specifically female illnesses, based on extensive reading in the classical tradition. This logic governed most Arabic writing on the topic, and it accounts for the flourishing of the one-sex body in Arabic medical encyclopedias produced by and for learned physicians. Centuries later, in late medieval Europe, claiming similarities between the male and female genitals also played into the hands of learned surgeons, a new professional group that had begun to appear in Italian cities in the late 13th and 14th centuries, and it grounded their claims to competence to treat the genitals of women as well as men. Finally, the reappearance of the two-sex body was tightly bound up with a wave of interest in the Hippocratic treatises on diseases of women, beginning in the early 16th century, which became part of a successful attempt by male physicians to mark out a broadly defined field of gynecology as a medical specialty. Okay, so here we go. That's sort of premises, and now I'm going to try and string together the narrative. Because the idea of the one-sex body, as I have defined it, was Galenic, it's no surprise that it flourished mostly when and where works of Galen were readily available. Initially, this did not include the Latin West, where well into the 13th century, the very limited body of medical works in circulation lacked both anatomical specificity and a theoretical substructure based on the complexions and the humors. In contrast, Galenism flourished in the territories of the Abbasid Empire in the Near and Middle East, where the entire corpus of classical Greek medical writing was translated into Arabic by the beginning of the 9th century. Learned medicine, as expounded and practiced at court, in urban hospitals and pharmacies, and in the schools of individual medical masters, was first and foremost Galenic, and remained so throughout the medieval period. It was broadly hospitable to the ideas that men's and women's bodies were closely related versions of one another, that women produced seed necessary to generation, and that the treatment of men's and women's illnesses could be discussed in the same works and treated by the same physicians, and that there were rough analogies between the parts of the male and female genitals. The operative word here is rough, for with few exceptions, Arabic medical writers acknowledged correspondences between the male and female genitals without adopting the idea that they were topological inversions of one another, let alone that the male genitals had been extruded on account of complexional heat. Rather, they emphasized differences in size, shape, and texture between the corresponding parts of the male and female genitals. The correspondence between the male and female testicles, or ovaries, was easiest to accept, while the correspondence between the uterus and scrotum was particularly counterintuitive and tended to be omitted altogether. Authors who adopted that strategy included two 10th century Persian physicians, Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi in his book for al-Mansur, and Ali ibn al-Abbas al-Majusi in his highly influential synopsis of Galenic theory and practice, the complete representation of the medical art. Both works circulated widely in Latin Europe as well as in the Middle East. According to al-Majusi, and you can see here the limitations, his sort of qualifying of the homologies into kind of general correspondences. You should know that these organs in males and females are one thing, but they differ in their shape and essence. The two testicles in women are rounded and hard, and in men elongated and soft. The spermatic vessels in men are long and hard, and in women short and soft. And the penis in males is rectangular, I'm not sure what that's about, and hard, and the vagina in women is short and soft. And the clitoris in women stands in place of the foreskin in men. Here, the introduction of the clitoris already acted to disrupt the Galenic homologies. Furthermore, the uterus, which you'll see is lacking here, Al-Majusi compared the uterus not to the scrotum but to the bladder, following Galen's treatise, The Anatomy of the Uterus, rather than On the Use of Parts. Strict correspondences between the male and female genitals were also undermined in Al-Majusi's treatment of genital diseases and treatments. For example, seminal retention could be life-threatening for women, while men suffered more from loss of too much seed. Furthermore, because men neither menstruated nor gave birth, there was a host of pathological conditions related to these two functions with which they didn't need to contend. Hypermenorrhea, and amenorrhea, which, like seminal retention, could be fatal, and suffocation of the uterus, which resulted from both. Then there were the issues attendant on pregnancy, including its sequelae, such as obstetrical fistula and uterine prolapse. The only aspect of procreation that lay outside the bailiwick of Galenic physicians like Al-Razi and Al-Majusi was childbirth itself, handled by midwives. And you can see here that the male experts are all up on the second floor, and the midwife is down there with the laboring woman. Despite these specifically female illnesses, however, the authors of these and other Arabic compendia of Galenic medicine assumed that learned physicians would be treating both men and women, since men's and women's bodies were broadly similar. The similarity broke down only when it came to conditions related to childbearing and menstruation, but even there it was expected that physicians would be consulted and needed to know what to do. This broadly inclusive nature of the learned physician's practice is illustrated in the Book of Experiences. That's the third item there. Al-Razi's casebook, which contains more than 800 brief accounts of notable clinical encounters collected over the course of a long career, collected by him. Of these, 270 concerned female patients who consulted Al-Razi concerning a great many specifically female conditions, including uterine suffocation, uterine pain, burning in the vagina, retention of the placenta after childbirth, hypermenorrhea to exhaustion, foul-smelling vaginal discharge, and menstrual blood of an unusual consistency or color. The main limits on learned medical practice were not doctrinal or conceptual, but concerned access to their female patients' bodies. Women might describe their symptoms and bring their urine for analysis, or this might be done through intermediaries. When necessary, physicians might examine parts not usually exposed. For example, one of Al-Razi's cases includes his comments on the visual appearance and feel of a woman's cancerous breast. In contrast, inspection and touching of the female genitals by a male practitioner seems to have been very problematic, as is clear from a passage in the early 11th century medical encyclopedia of the Andalusian physician Abu al-Qasim al-Zahrawi. And this is a great title, and an aid for those who lack the capacity to read long books. It's actually a very long book itself, but presumably it's less long than all of the books of Galen. And I've shifted now to Muslim Spain because al-Zahrawi was born just outside of Cordoba. Al-Zahrawi described the treatment of women suffering from bladder stones as difficult and hindered by a number of things. One is that the woman may be a virgin. Another, that you will not find a woman who will expose herself to a male doctor if she's modest or married. If necessity compels you to undertake this kind of case, you should take with you a competent woman doctor. As these are very uncommon, if you are without them, then seek a eunuch doctor as a colleague, or bring a midwife experienced in women's ailments, or a woman to whom you may give some instruction in this art. And this is particularly in the surgical part of his compendium, and it's clear that they're talking about procedures that involve looking at and touching a woman's genital area. I now turn, and I'll take that issue of touching women's genitals shortly. I now turn to Latin Christian Europe, where Galen's texts were translated into Latin later than into Arabic, and often they were translated from Arabic into Latin. In particular, Galen's massive On the Use of Parts, so central to Laqueur's One-Sex Body, was not translated into Latin until 1318 and not printed until the 1520s, so long time after the rest of Galen had been printed in Latin. Its circulation in manuscript was extremely limited because it was a really long book. Instead, learned medical readers and writers relied on more digestible translations and adaptations of Arabic medical encyclopedias, such as those of al-Majusi, al-Razi, and al-Zarawi, which were translated into Latin over the course of the late 11th and 12th centuries. As a result, most medieval Latin discussions of genital anatomy and physiology follow the pattern found in these encyclopedic texts, in the form of a loose account of correspondences between parts of the male and female genitals, excluding the uterus and omitting the trope of topological inversion. And I should say that they actually, I was just looking on the train, I was looking at some of the texts, and the Latin versions are much looser. I mean, the Arabic ones are fairly loose, but you can see an even more of a pulling away by the Latin writers from the notion of homology and inversion. At the same time, like the Arabic treatises, they placed the uterus and its functions, menstruation and the ability to conceive and carry offspring, at the center of female physiology. While men's and women's bodies were not considered opposites and were understood to share important aspects of their non-reproductive anatomy, their genitals were presented as wholly distinct in function and form, much more so, as I said, than by Arabic writers. And here, the one on the left, you will notice from the poster, this situation is reflected in a pair of diagrams of the male and female genitals that circulated widely in late medieval Europe. This is a late 13th century English manuscript. Little is known about their origin, but it's clear that the image of the female genitals on the left and the male genitals on the right are not informed by the idea of homology. And you can see the male genitals, you'll see the testicles and the scrotum, you'll see the prostate, and then it bears no relationship whatsoever to this schematic of the sort of the Y-shaped form in the middle. The vertical stroke would be the vagina. Then you can see the cervix, and the arms of the Y are the ligaments that hold the uterus inside the pelvis so that it can't wander. And then you see the fetus in its fetal sac, and the female testicles are sort of dangling down below. Okay, so definitely there's no visible homology in this diagram, and I think that this represents a sort of increasing pulling away from the Galenic tradition in the later Middle Ages. Also, very little view of or representation of homology in the model of the uterus that had come to dominate learned accounts of the genitals in late medieval Europe. This had been laid out by Mondino de Liuzzi, professor of medicine at the University of Bologna in the early 14th century, and the author of the first Latin anatomy textbook based on human dissection. And this is a manuscript, a French manuscript from 1345, prepared by an Italian physician for the King of France, and it is basically a pictorial version of Mondino's extremely influential anatomy textbook. Mondino's description of the uterus incorporated a much older idea according to which the cavity of the uterus was made up of 7 cells, of which the 3 on the left were reserved for female fetuses and the 3 on the right for males, while the one in the middle accommodated the occasional hermaphrodite. These cells appear clearly in the illustration. This is from the same manuscript. The painting shows the uterus's 7 cells, together with the fact that it is secured within the pelvis by ligaments, represented as small hooks between the cells, and you can just barely see them up there on the right. I have juxtaposed it here with a corresponding painting of male anatomy. And there's no sign of the Galenic homology. In fact, Mondino's overall take on the relationship between the male and female genitals is summarized in a single sentence. You must know that the members of generation in men and women are similar in some respects, and in some respects not. Rather, they differ. Mondino further weakened the correspondences, and this is a big one, by denying that women's testicles produced seed necessary for generation. And so he's really pulling way back from the Galenic idea. And this was part of the increasing influence of Aristotle in late medieval European medical theory. In sum, the account of human anatomy and physiology in learned Latin medicine outside surgery was considerably farther removed from Laqueur's one-sex model than its Arabic counterpart. In this connection, it's worth noting that On the Use of Parts, long available in Latin translation, did not appear in the 3 incunabula editions of Galen's opera Omnia, published beginning in 1490. Interestingly, the main exception to this lack of interest in the Galenic model of sex difference was late 13th and 14th century writers on surgery. The most famous of these, Guy of Chauliac, was one of the very few medieval Latin medical writers who actually knew and used the Latin translation of On the Use of Parts. In his Great Surgery of 1363, Guy referred directly to Book 14, describing the uterus as, quote, like a penis reversed or placed on the outside. And here this is a 15th century manuscript, but it shows him dissecting, which he certainly did. Furthermore, he treated the homology not simply as a metaphor or a mnemonic, but as a fact with therapeutic consequences. Conditions of the male and female genitals should be treated in the same way. The use of the Galenic homology by surgeons, as opposed to by physicians, might be explained in a couple of ways. On the one hand, as Michael McVaugh has suggested, surgeons needed ways to visualize the three-dimensional topology of the internal organs, and the homology allowed them to claim that they could apply their extensive knowledge of the easily accessible male genitals to female conditions. This development tracks with the increasing presence in late medieval surgical treatises of procedures for treating hernia, uterine prolapse, and vaginal obstruction, which has been documented by Monica Green. At the same time, learned surgeons could also wrap themselves in the mantle of Galenic authority to argue for the superiority of their procedures to those of their unlearned male and female competitors who would previously have had a monopoly in this kind of work. And you can see here, this is again Guy, there are books all over the study and consulting room and lecture room of this famous surgeon. In this case, invoking the one-sex body allowed a group of ambitious practitioners to expand their claims to competence in an area from which they were previously excluded. So just very little on sort of my last period. In contrast to the later Middle Ages, the years around 1500 saw a wave of enthusiasm for the one-sex idea, so this was new, among the anatomical avant-garde of Western Europe. By this I mean a small group of writers who wrote long specialized treatises on anatomy based on both their own experience with dissection and their detailed reading of Galen's still unpublished On the Use of Parts. Inspired by the Renaissance, the humanist impulse, first to understand as well as possible what Galen had actually written, as opposed to the mediated version available in medieval compilations, and second, to test what he wrote against the evidence of human dissection, the authors of the 3 longest and most elaborate anatomical works before the mid-16th century endorsed Galen's homology. The first of these works, by Gabriele Zerbi, professor of anatomy at the universities in Padua and Bologna, appeared in 1502. Unillustrated, enormous, and tedious even to his peers, and deeply tedious to me. It included a very long section on the uterus where he observed, as you can see here, the galenic homologies. And it's in a much more clearer and less qualified form. In fact, Zemurray went a step further than Galen in his argument, extending it into the realm of therapeutics. Specifically, he wrote that it was not necessary to treat a prolapsed uterus, since this basically mimics the natural extrusion of the male genitals, a natural state and therefore not a serious problem. Women who suffer from this condition do not become male in the process. He's specific on that point, but their genitals should not be considered diseased. As I've already said, the 16th century account that comes closest to Laqueur's one-sex body is that of Jacopo Berengario da Carpi. And he, I'm just trying to move along here, he is both a surgeon, so I think he's bringing in this surgical interest in the one-sex body, but he also has humanist aspirations, so that's part of it as well. He wants to be a real Galenist. And Berengario's interesting because alone among any Latin medical writers I know, he adduced a radical corollary to the homology. Although men cannot change into women because nature tends towards perfection, women can turn into men if something happens, so their genitals are expelled, like uterine prolapse or heating up. His principal authority for this fact was Book 7 of Pliny's Natural History, which offers 4 examples. Berengario diluted the effect of this pronouncement by enumerating differences between the corresponding male and female organs, but his commitment to the idea of homology is clear. I would also include Vesalius as a qualified supporter of the one-sex body. His figures of the male and female testicles, and that's what you see in these 2 images, illustrate what he considered the most robust of the parallels between parts of the male and female genitals. So this is the testicles and spermatic vessels. And you can see they're sort of hanging free in the male. As far as I'm concerned, he wrote, you may assign whatever name you wish to these organs in women, since they match the organs of men in form and substance. In fact, Vesalius considered the similarity of the female to the male testicles to be the best argument against late medieval Aristotelian physiologists like Mondino, that women themselves produce seed. And here, I want you to look at the middle of this image where you can actually see the kidneys and the spermatic vessels and the testes. And it's fading into a female image, and I hope you can see that it really is extraordinarily similar. I was astounded when I started matching up the parts. So although Vesalius Fabrica avoided the wilder reaches of one-sexness, it contains no references to prolapsed uteruses as penis or women turning into men. And in fact, he qualified the analogies between the corresponding male and female parts in ways that were taken up by later writers. The thick muscular wall of the uterus is very different from the thin, delicate scrotum. The male testicles are large, soft, and homogeneous, while the female ones are small and hard, with internal articulations in the form of fluid-filled cavities, which you can see there. In sum, I think the idea that the male and female genitals were homologous found powerful support on the part of a handful of professional anatomical writers in the first half of the 16th century, of whom Vesalius was arguably the most influential, in large part because they had begun to read and genuinely assimilate Galen's On the Use of Parts, which was finally published in 1528. But the appeal of the one-sex body was relatively short-lived among Latin writers, who moved quickly from the assimilation to the critique of Galen based on their own dissection of human cadavers. Already in the 1530s, Nicolas Massa prefaced his retelling of the homology with the words, "some people say." Even more pointed critiques by learned anatomists accelerated and intensified over the course of the second half of the 16th century, as has been amply documented by Michael Stolberg and Helen King. And Stolberg and King point out sort of this kind of increasing momentum of heaping abuse on this ridiculous old wives' tale of the parallelisms between the genitals. They use words like it's inept, it's ridiculous. This is another one. In fact, by the end of the second decade of the 17th century, the vast majority of learned medical writers rejected the Galenic homology between the male and female genitals with all of its implications, including the possibility that women could change into men. And King, I think, is right in identifying another equally important factor, which was the publication of the complete Hippocratic works, including the treatises on diseases of women, in 1525. In King's words, 16th and 17th century writers stressed that each sex has its purpose. They were not only more familiar with the female body as a result of dissection, but also had a greater knowledge of a Hippocratic model of difference, which, Hippocratic model of difference. You can see I was changing my mind on the train. The development of anatomical inquiry was probably the most important factor in this development. But King's stress on the importance of the dichotomous Hippocratic model of the female body is certainly also a factor. Now, I was going to do a conclusion, but I've gone over, so I think maybe we'll just go to the commentators, and then, general thoughts can emerge in the discussion.
Thank you. So we will hear from Joel Kay and Hamilton.
And should we just turn this off?
Sure. You can turn the machine off?
I would unplug it, but then I'm afraid it's just going to dissolve into static.
Yeah. I don't at all. Well, there's so many aspects of this talk that really deserve commenting. I've chosen this wonderful talk, I should say. Really.
Thank you.
I've chosen the direction of historical writing, to think about the proposal of the one-sex, two-sex model as a species of historical writing and the problems in that species. So Professor Park, as you can see from this talk, she has always tackled the big subjects. She's never shied away from making claims large enough to recast the historical narrative, but she's always sought to limit her claims to those that can be securely supported by her primary sources. To take but one example, in her 2006 book, Secrets of Women, she spends as much time in her introduction outlining what her sources do not and cannot reveal as what they can and do. Although she employs dozens of primary sources in this study, she is still careful to insist, quote, ignoring linguistic and cultural boundaries obscures the important part played by specific lines of influence and by local traditions in anatomical practices, texts, and illustrations. With this and many other similar comments, I doubt she'd claim that she's doing anything more than what serious historians have always done and must continue to do. It is from this perspective that she has examined the single-sex to double-sex narrative, and it is from this perspective that she demonstrates its serious weaknesses. In his book, Making Sex, Tom Laqueur did what most historians do, what I myself have done and do, in order to shine a light on what he saw as a moment of profound change in the history of gender in the 18th century, to bring it into the foreground, so to speak, He flattened out the history of the historical period, or in his case, the historical periods that preceded his. My sense is that this kind of flattening may, to some degree, be almost unavoidable, especially for those historians like myself who look for and are sensitive to and focus on historical change more than historical continuities. Since few or none of us have the capacity to fully master the complex textual histories within our own period, we are, almost inescapably, considerably less able to do justice to the literature from periods and cultures other than our own. But degree may be the crucial consideration here. If our goal is to lessen the degree of flattening, which I think it should be, we need to think about how to accomplish this. The first requirement may simply be awareness, self-awareness of this tendency. It may require the willingness to moderate our claims, as precious to us as they are, when confronted either by textual counterexamples or by criticism from historians far better schooled in other periods than we are. It may require the assiduous seeking of advice from those historians when in the process of writing, or the recasting of arguments before publication on the basis of criticisms sought and offered. In the final analysis, it may require the repudiation of certain arguments, even years after they have appeared in print, if the evidence against them has grown strong. And I suggest that this may be especially necessary if our challenged claims appear to have been uncritically accepted by a large part of our reading audience. If our error turns out to fit neatly into the mistaken preconceptions of our audience, we have a special responsibility to re-examine our claims. When this self-examination doesn't occur, the errors that can derive from flattening extend from the work in question, of course, to the reception of the work. As Professor Park notes, the one-sex, two-sex model appears to have been widely embraced by scholars in literary and cultural studies and is currently being taught as an established fact in women's history classes, including at our own university. One might ask the question, so what? It's certainly not the only error floating around the classroom. And in the grand scheme of things, it is probably not the most damaging. But though no historian is naive enough to believe that errors can be eliminated from the historical narrative, virtually all of us believe that we are responsible for challenging them whenever we can. Moreover, we who have spent our lives trying to master the material from our own periods and to do some justice to those periods have a difficult time when we are flattened right alongside our period. When our protests, based on the evidence of our sources, go unheard, or even worse, are heard but ignored, we are made all too aware of our powerlessness to correct the historical narrative, even when we have the sources to support our attempt to correct it. Those of you who know about the debate within ISIS around this have seen just how heated it got and how quickly it got and how dismissive it became even of experts in the field. The negative impact of the one-sex, two-sex model is multiplied by the fact that it contributes to a much larger historical distortion. The idea that the modern two-sex model, and I put modern in quotation marks, has its origins somewhere in the Enlightenment, capital E, is based on the assumption that before then there was a single unified one-sex model persisting within learned medical theory for over 1,500 years since the time of Galen, persisting through its transference between profoundly different cultural contexts, from ancient pagan to Alexandrian Christian to Greek, Arabic, Hebrew, Persian, medieval Christian, and on to and through the Renaissance, to name only the coarsest cultural divisions that refracted the Galenic tradition. Professor Park shows clearly that this wasn't the case. But the question is, how could it even have been imagined to have been the case? Moreover, even if the focus is limited to Latin Christian culture, how could continuity through to the 18th century be asserted without considering a single medical text from the medieval period? given the general underappreciation of medieval intellectual culture, I suppose it might be possible, and maybe even easy, to imagine that medieval medical theory was simply too unsophisticated or too ill-informed to require consideration, especially compared to Renaissance texts, capital R. But this would be a huge mistake, one that speaks to a near-reflexive flattening of medieval intellectual culture on the part of those who seek to locate origins or beginnings in later periods of European history, the Renaissance, say, or the Enlightenment, say, without having to bother with the medieval period. Or better, by simply asserting what I'll call the swerve thesis, which is that nothing of intellectual note happened over these medieval centuries, so the development I've pinpointed can, ipso facto, lay clear claim to a true beginning. The evidence, however, reveals something very different. It reveals that the 13th and 14th centuries were unrivaled in their contribution to Galenical medical theory, certainly in the Latin tradition. Nancy Seriesi, a great historian of medicine and one of the rare experts in both medieval and Renaissance medicine, had this to say on the subject. Quote, "It is clear that by the early 14th century, important aspects of medicine had already acquired a shape they would retain until at least the late 16th century, and in some respects, in some areas, well beyond. These aspects included the organization and methodology of academic medical instruction, the structure of the medical profession, and large areas of the content of medical learning. The Galenic commentaries by Taddeo Alderotti, Arno of Villanova, Pietro d'Abano, Turisanus, and Gentile da Foligno, all written before the mid-14th century, are truly monumental works, which, for the most part, were still circulating and taken as authoritative well into the 17th century. When I studied these Galenic texts, I was not looking for what they had to say concerning male and female sex organs, or what they could reveal about the single-sex model. So I can't speak to this question without going back to them and looking anew. But I can offer a few general comments. In retrospect, the theoretical body that Galen assumes in the treatises I've examined can be taken to be, by default, both singular and male, although I don't remember it being specified as such. But with respect to the singular body, I agree with the judgment offered by Professor Park in a talk tonight. Quote, "It was perfectly possible to understand the male body as prior, superior, and generically human without assuming that the principal difference between male and female bodies lay in the homological and inverted relationship between their genitals, or that under the right circumstances woman could turn into man. Indeed, I think I can say with certainty that there was no talk in any of the medieval commentaries I consulted of women turning into men, or even more germane to a single-sex model, no talk of instability or mutability between the sexes. In Galenic theory, all human complexions are composed of a proportional, or thought to be composed, of a proportional mixture of the four elements and the four material causes, hotness, wetness, dryness, coldness, with the female complexion characterized as wetter than the male. But I never saw this used as an argument that a woman whose complexion was unusually dry, or a male whose complexion was unusually wet, would somehow be open to gender interchange. But I'm a relative tyro when it comes to the study of Galen. Anyone wishing to pursue the subject has the accumulated expertise of eminent scholars of medieval medicine available to consult. Cadden, Green, McVaugh, Jacquard, Garcia Ballester, and a host of others, including Professor Park herself. Finally, I think we need to question how much we can argue about attitudes towards sex and gender based entirely on the theoretical body that Galen presents. This was, to be sure, his teaching body, and he wanted the physician in training to learn how to sense and intuit its rhythms on the basis of its extraordinarily rich and many-layered descriptions of its complex workings. But for Galen, generalized theory was always intended as a means to an end, the cure of the individual body. That's who he was writing for. He was writing for physicians who were actually going to work with bodies, male and female. Indeed, even in theory, the particularity that Galen allows to each individual body, and each individual part of the body, and each individual complexion of each individual part, is quite simply astounding, or at least I found it so. Since every body is distinct, and each bodily complexion has its own particular proportional mixture that defines its proper balance or health, a mixture which naturally shifts in relation to changes in age, climate, and a dozen other factors, the doctor must train himself to ground his diagnoses and his prescriptions in the inescapable reality of difference. This may be the primary lesson that Galen teaches his readers. For this reason alone, presenting the Galenic body as if it could be associated primarily or solely with a single fixed and unitary model with respect to sex can't help but be a distortion, one that really does need correcting, and one that can only benefit from a fuller and deeper reading of the sources. Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Let's move on.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick because I'm sure you have lots of questions. My urge is the same as Joel's to talk more generally, use this as an opportunity to talk more generally about historical narrative, and it's something that I think your exemplary investigation of this topic and debunking of a very popular and well-known or well-accepted theory or narrative inspires. Let me begin by quoting from Harvard University Press's website about Laqueur's 1990 book. And okay, this isn't meant to be hyperbole, but it says that this book tells an astonishing story of sex in the West, from the ancients to the moderns, in a precise account of developments in reproductive anatomy and physiology. We will be amazed at the plots into which they have been woven. Two master plots emerge. In the one-sex story, woman is an imperfect version of man. Her anatomy and physiology are construed accordingly. The second plot, the two-sex story, which dominates post-Enlightenment thinking, says that the body determines gender and differences, that woman is the opposite of man, etc., etc. Science may establish many new facts, but even so, Laqueur argues, science was only providing a new means of speaking, a rhetoric, and not a key to female liberation or social progress. Laqueur posits that destiny is anatomy, sex, in other words, is an artifice. This is a powerful story written with verve and a keen sense of telling detail. After Making Sex, Laqueur went on to write what sounds, and I haven't read it, an equally astonishing history filled with verve, Solitary Sex, A Cultural History of Masturbation. Now I'd like to quote from a review of Laqueur's 1976 book, Religion and Respectability, Sunday Schools and the English Working Class Culture, 1780 to 1850. This review was written by Daniel Pauls from Center College, Danville, Kentucky, and appeared in Church History. He writes, in the making of the English working class, E.P. Thompson persuaded himself and others after him that the English Sunday school was a tool of social oppression. The present study, writes Thomas Laqueur, began with the thought of confirming Thompson's thesis, but concludes that the truth is, if not quite the opposite, certainly very different. Close study of Sunday school records, statistics, and memoirs shows it to have been chiefly a working-class institution, a beacon of education. Laqueur's argument rarely sparkles, but it does convince, end quote. So what happened in Laqueur's scholarly art and writing style between these two books? Well, I would assert that, like so many other historians, for example, Peter Gay in The Education of the Senses, that Laqueur discovered Foucault and the body as a result of Foucault's History of Sexuality, which was published in French in 1976 through 84 and translated into English in 1977 through 86. We might think of what occurred between these two books as the sexual revolution of the 60s being worked out by historians in the 70s and 80s, and I think in quite different ways by male and female historians. So to bolster my assertion about what took place between his two books, I'll quote Laqueur's response to Michael Stolberg, in which, in the 2003 exchange in ISIS. He writes, Laqueur writes, My quarrel with Michael Stolberg is not primarily about whether what I call the one-sex model collapsed 150 years earlier than I claim it did. Over the millennia, what is a century or two? It would not matter so much if it were not for a larger question, whether the Renaissance and Reformation or the Age of Reason witnessed the triumph of a new reductionism, a new epistemology grounded in the natural world that produced a view of sexual difference in which the body was the final arbiter and not an imperfect sign, in which biology was said to entail gender roles rather than merely reflect them. End quote. Here I think we have the heart of Laqueur's effort. He strives to map out worldviews, epistemes, that endure over millennia and then are overturned in ruptures, of course, like Foucault, which he draws upon, and which Foucault most famously in his 1966, Les Mots et les Choses, The Order of Things, translated as The Order of Things in 1970, where the Renaissance episteme of analogy and similitude gives way in a crisis of representation to the classical nominalist episteme of words, to the modern 19th century episteme of the authority of nature. These worldviews or cultural fields, these epistemes, structure thought and action within them, and history can and should be written as an archaeology of the episteme and its tectonic shifts and restructurings. Like Foucault, Laqueur's evidence is almost exclusively textual and visual, which Katie points out and elegantly shows the deficiencies of in this paper in her discussion about the ambitions of surgeons to capture the field of gynecology and the changing engagement with the work of Galen from 1500 to 1600 in her section, especially on theory in the context of practice. But I think this genealogy of Laqueur's work brings us to the reason why, as Katie says, that, quote, historians of early modern medicine with strong views on the topic, among which she includes herself, have not weighed in earlier or more audibly on Laqueur's thesis. Well, it's hard to argue with an episteme, especially one that seems to be predicated on the idea that only books and ideas cause change. Where does one begin? I often talk to students about Foucault's analysis because, of course, I still have them read it, the Order of Things, as rather wide gauge to fit what I know of historical reality, and too impersonal and deus ex machina, or perhaps deus ex mente, to fit how I understand historical change to take place. But just to return to one more part of Foucault that Laqueur, I think, discovered in the 70s, was that the body and sexuality was invested with power relations. I probably don't need to note this, that Foucault was, of course, searching out Nietzschean genealogies in order to unmask the ways in which human beings have tricked themselves to expose the great lies like God, morality, truth, and science for what they are, that is, human constructions. In his 1975 book, Discipline and Punish, that was a Freudian slip. Foucault writes, quote, in fact, power produces. It produces reality. It produces domains of objects and rituals of truth. The individual and the knowledge that may be gained of him belong to this production. And when the normal took over from the ancestral, measurement from status, thus substituting for the individuality of the memorable man that of the calculable man, that moment when the sciences of man became possible is the moment when a new technology of power and a new political anatomy of the body were implemented. So, thus Foucault. So, to conclude, I don't think that Laqueur would actually be bothered by Katie's persuasive debunking of his thesis, because the facts here are actually peripheral to the episteme, or as Laqueur said about Stolberg, this is really just skirmishes on the metaphysical periphery. Because it seems that in order to confront Laqueur with the details of Katie's argument, we would need to occupy his ground. That is, do we accept his view of historical change and argue on his terms, or do we seek to overturn through small sorties like this view of history? Do we accept that the logics of a worldview or relational field structure the culture of that period, and that it is these kinds of big, deep histories that explain large questions, and of course, in Laqueur's case, attract a lot of attention from a larger public than our small subfields. And I'm really I'm using this as a way to think about what happened here last Monday night at this time, the history manifesto that advocated with some hyperbole big histories that speak to the public. And I don't really think that the way that they post it as a debate between microhistory and other kinds of history is actually what's at stake. So I have to admit that for myself, I have contrary instincts. I like sweeping narrative, have myself argued in those terms, especially in CC, in teaching CC. But I also, and this is maybe a kind of guilty secret, I love footnotes and the empiricism they embody, the meticulous working out and rebutting of accepted wisdom. I think we can all offer examples of how both approaches made a difference in our understanding of the course of history. Indeed, we need actually go no further than Laqueur's first book, Rebutting the Grand and Good Narrative of E.P. Thompson. And, on the other hand, go no further than Foucault's work, or Nietzsche's for that matter, which, however wide gauge it may be, it actually proves tremendously exhilarating and liberating in opening up the broad prospect. So what to do? If we accept that Helen King and Katie Park tonight have proven that the vast majority of learned medical writers rejected the homology of Vesalius's especially image before 1600, then can we say that Laqueur's thesis is definitively defunct? Does his larger point about reductionism and the authority of nature become invalid on this evidence? Because he uses the one-sex body as a foil, obviously. I have to say that I think that any structure that posits a very clear before and after is suspect, like Laqueur's does. But this is a question I want to ask you, Katie. I mean, do you think that this is sortieing on the margins, on the peripheries, or not? And my larger question for all of you to open up the discussion goes back to last Monday's event here. What to do with big history versus, and I won't call it small, I'll call it meticulous history. Should we just ecumenically accept both as valid approaches, matters of temperament and taste, or are there more important stakes, like whether we believe that social and cultural change can only occur through rupture, discontinuity, or whether effective change happens slowly in ways that can be attributed to trackable strategies and ambitions on the part of human beings acting in what we can figure out as a more or less rational or at least recognizable way, as Trilling argued in his work. So my question is first to Katie and also to all of you, and I hope that you will solve this question of historical change once and for all.
Would you like to respond briefly to some of these points before we open it up? Or?
I'll just say a couple of things, but I really also want to hear what other people have to say. Thank you both for those. They're very helpful and just made me think in all kinds of directions, including sort of thinking about why we didn't weigh in. And I think, as much as anything, that Laqueur's general parade, his general Foucauldian parade, we didn't want to rain on that parade. It was like it was progressive, it was liberatory. He obviously, even if it was sort of in a screwed up way, saw himself as a feminist, and it turned out that maybe that narrative wasn't the exact right way to express one's feminism by saying that women were really just men. But when I put myself back into that period, when I think about what it was like to organize a seminar on women's history in the mid-'80s in Caroline, you couldn't. I mean, the number of narratives we had to play with, we were sort of making them up. And I remember having a discussion afterwards with some people at a seminar where we just wanted to get out of only two narratives that we could think of, which were Screwed Again or bloody but unbowed. And, you know, that was all you could think of. And it's like, this was something complex to say, rather. So that it felt like it would be taking the wrong side to argue against it. But on the other hand, we felt very strongly as people who were just coming out of graduate school and, you know, had been trained to read primary sources and think responsibly about them. We were really, really torn, I think. So that's one thing. And then just a couple of words about the sort of the so what, the skirmishes on the margin. Well, I would say two things about that. One is that these so-called big histories, and I just read David Armitage's article, I can't remember, was it Age?
The history manifesto was the one that was
he has an article in which he sort of uses the concept of civil war, writes a big history of it, which has one chunk that goes from the first century BCE to Augustine, and then he jumps to the 19th century. And it's like, please, you know, this is big history. You know, it's easy to write big history if you're going to drop out 1,400 years every single time you try to do it. So yeah, I just sort of, as a person interested in that 1,400 years, find that a little cavalier. And whether it's done by David Armitage or Laqueur. But what I think is really at stake for me is two things. And one of them, the first one I'm going to talk about, is sort of emergent. Both of them are really emergent. One is the incredible Eurocentrism of the narrative. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's just astounding. And that's one of the ways when I went back to this material, and I don't read Arabic, so luckily there are some historians who are beginning to work on this material in Arabic medical texts. You know, you cannot possibly write a history of what he claimed to be writing history of without dealing with the place that Galenism flourished above all, which was in this huge tract of time and space. And I just, you know, the more I think about not just this narrative, but say to go to history of science, the narrative of the scientific revolution. I mean, none of these narratives can hold if you don't artificially firewall off the Arabic material.
Oh, it's astounding. Yeah, that would I really appreciate it.
And I just think that the firewalling off, it happened already in the Renaissance. It was called Humanism. Mm-hmm. It happened in the 20th century with all of these narratives. In the 19th century already, Marlowe's already showed that there's just a series of firewalls that have been erected in order to kind of quarantine the Arabic material. So that to me is one of the things that I think is at stake, which is why I'm co-writing a history of medieval science with an Arabist. The other is, and I have much less to say about this, but it just, maybe other people will know, it's more and more my discomfort with modernity as an explanatory category. It's like, what is that? You know, it's like it's not a thing. It's
us.
It's us.
It's us.
It's us.
We're separated from them.
Yeah, and Rainey calls it Lorraine Daston, she calls it the dark star, that you can't see it, you can't define it, but it distorts, its huge gravitational field just distorts anything within 1,000 miles of it. And at some point, I really think we should start thinking in history of science about it, because, you know, we made it. Mm-hmm. It's up to us to try and think critically about it, because we sold it to people and they bought it. But, you know, do we want really to be in that business? And wouldn't it be interesting to try and see things in a different way? So for me, those are the two reasons why it's not just skirmishes.
Thank you.
So let's open this up to questions. Yes, please. Could you identify yourself?
I'm sorry?
Could you identify yourself?
Yes, Michael McKeon, Rutgers University.
Thank you.
I haven't looked at Laqueur for a while. My impression is that he's not as Foucauldian as we're speaking of him as being. Partly because Foucault is even more Foucauldian than we're speaking of him. I think the problem that most people perceived with him was that he found historical change to occur within 25 or 30 years of the end of the 18th century. And I don't think that's what Laqueur is doing. I think Laqueur begins at least a century earlier and assembles evidence from that time. Now, of course, that still seems an astonishingly small period in which the world can change, but this whole discussion, rightly and fascinatingly, raises the question of what is historical change? How do you give evidence that it has occurred? At the polar opposite ends of, say, a 2,000-year period, I think it's incontrovertible that one can insist, and everybody agrees, that change has occurred. The way we think, the way we do things, the way culture and technology operated in the 21st century are very different from those in classical Greece. So then, the question is, what's the chunk of time that is sufficient to allow, with very deep learning, that one has covered the field in which change might have occurred? The problem with very deep learning is that, about a very small period, is that it's impossible to find any evidence of change. The wider you go with very deep learning, the more you're likely to find evidence of that. But then you are vulnerable to the charge that you are speaking too much in terms of continuity, or discontinuity, and not enough in continuity. So, I mean, this is maybe the fundamental problem of historiography, and it's a wonderful thing to think and talk about. Our discussion right now has emphasized one end of it, but there is the other end. How does change occur? How do we describe it?
Thank you. I'm going to put myself next. And I had three thoughts. One is whether you have any thoughts on how the story would look if you looked at literary tropes. I'm thinking of Tiresias, the image of Tiresias, which I would have thought, as a layman, argued pretty forcibly for a kind of two-sex view of things pretty early back. And in general, legends of metamorphosis, treatments of Ovid, and so on. The second is I'd actually quite like to hear your thoughts, Katie, on what might be lost if we did away with the concept of modernity. Or do you think anything would be lost? Would it just be a good thing? Or are there things that might be lost that we should worry about? And the third is a question about whether there is a kind of narrative and an argument of your own here. And it seemed to me that perhaps there was, which is we need a more extensive swing through the Mediterranean to encompass the Arab world. For reasons that Pamela will know about, I'll raise a little mini question mark about Byzantium in all of this, but in any case, so we have to have a big geography here. But there seemed also to be an argument lurking in here that I never heard you sort of pin your colours to, which is that this is all about surgeons, and that the Galenic theories are useful to surgeons who want to expand their business. And I'm intrigued whether they can have other means of expanding their business, how plausible that really is. So maybe another question or two, if anybody wants to, otherwise... Do you want to?
Well, I would like to hear what Caroline has to say about metamorphosis, because I don't feel particularly that I could address it with anything like the knowledge that she has. I do think that the vernacular stuff is terrifically important, and in a sense, what I'd like to see is this is sort of clearing the way, because the people who work on vernacular, they don't work on the Latin stuff, so they trust what someone like Laqueur says, and then it makes it easy and fun to say all kinds of things. But I think probably it's really, really interesting. The vernacular tradition is really, really interesting as long as you give it its autonomy and don't pretend that it's just that a high culture learned tradition somehow is just a more abstract version of what everybody else is thinking. I mean, it's sort of the cheese and the worms model. And so I would love to see people now go back and actually work on the vernacular stuff, because I think the stories would be more interesting. And the question about the positive argument, I mean, I've never written anything before that was so negative, that was just, I've never written a debunking, primarily debunking thing before. And I guess, I don't know, about modernity, I feel like I'm maybe not the right person to lead with that question, because, what do I know about modernity? I never have taken a course on the period later.
You do away with it, so you must know something.
I honestly don't know. I would love to know what people in this room think about that. It's very hard for me to see anything but that it's sort of distorting and unhelpful and teleological and gets us into narratives that simply are going to be unproductive. And I suppose if I had something positive to say about that, about modernity, that in the history of science at least, can we at least push modernity back to the late 19th century? I mean, the idea of the 17th century as representative of modernity or modern science is so preposterous that I can't believe anyone still talks about it.
Can I just say something about modernity? I mean, I think that it is terribly distorting in history, but I do think that it gives us an Archimedean point outside of which to stand, and that, I think, is the main problem, is what do we do in terms of all kinds of huge questions of culture and ethics if we don't actually have someplace like that.
I guess I had somewhat of an observation or reflection has to do with the relationship between texts and external institutions, which piggybacks a little bit on your question, because I'm interested in, let's say, criteria for the selection of texts. Obviously, you're interested in the medical profession, particularly surgeons, professionalization of medicine. So part of my question also reveal my own ignorance about professionalization of gynecology, let's put it that way. But I suppose one of the things that was interesting but also so flawed about Foucault and Laqueur, to the extent that we can bundle them together, was this external biopolitics and the almost immanence of the state as this tentacle of power is somehow almost being a way to canonize and exclude certain texts. So I'm wondering what the external institution is for you that makes your texts important, because obviously the texts of the surgeons that you cite are seeking legitimacy, and there's something very political about that, and it does maybe interface in some way with older ways of thinking about the emergence of the state and let's say concern about biopolitics. But I'm wondering if so, if you think there's a case to be made for that, or if you think that because these surgeons also had to speak to political authorities, or if you think that this is really an internal professional question.
That's a good question.
Did I have to go before civic authorities? I'm just curious about the performative. It just raised issues for me about the performative value of these anatomical texts. Beyond what we think about as the anatomical theater and beyond that performative value, but the sort of political performative value. Because one of the things I never could make heads or tails of was the relationship between the texts and the court cases of the Kurtz book. And he has this sort of uncanny yet powerful suggestion about how this played itself out in adjudication cases. So I'm just wondering if there's any of that you could shed any light on that would make maybe a little bit more sense of some of the politics that you think that's more relevant.
Yeah, I mean, as far as the surgeons are concerned, and I'm also, I mean, Michael McFawn, it's not just me, Michael McFawn and Monica Green have been really helpful about this. God, politics, I mean, the professional organizations within which they're working, and in some they are subordinate to the physicians and in some they're not. I mean, these emerged in the course of really the 13th and 14th centuries in a political order in which there was really no state. I mean, there just wasn't anything that corresponded to it. There were a bunch of corporations, guilds kind of clashing and making claims. It was extremely combative. The whole professional scene was extremely combative, precisely because there really weren't persuasive credentialing mechanisms. So
it's really the medical marketplace, isn't it?
it is
I mean,
the medical
isn't
market.
That really
Yeah,
the
it is.
institution which they're.
I think that is, and it's the patients, and the patients, they're looking for ways to distinguish between, I mean, you know, you're a patient, it's like trying to find a good car mechanic. It's like, who are you going to believe? Where are you going to get information? And it's really nice to have an institution like, you know, whatever that list is, who is it? Angie's List or something like that, where someone's actually going to tell you, you know, who is going to be a better surgeon for you than someone else. So I think that the patients, that a lot of the way we now think of the history of medicine that we didn't in the 1990s is from the point of view of patient demand, how enormously that's really what shaped it. So it's thousands of individuals and families making decisions, trying to figure out who is going to be a good doctor and who is not. And so, you know, anything you can do, I mean, if you can wear a red robe, if you can, you know, have a gold ring, if you can have books in your study, you know, any little thing like that might tip the balance. I had another thought while you were talking, and I was thinking about one of the things that what I was going to say in my conclusion is how different things, sort of feminist scholarship was in the 1990s and the 2000s, that something really different. That in the 1980s and 90s it was all about opening up, and now it's sort of about setting limits and, you know, trying to figure out, you know, what were the institutions that kind of limited what people could think or say, not in the sense of authoritarian, because that, I mean, in the societies I study, nobody had enough control to control what people were saying. I mean, the people who got in trouble were like tiny fly speck compared to everybody else who was just, you know, giving it their best shot. But I sort of feel like, I was trying to think, okay, why is the texture of the scholarship that's been written beginning in about 2000 so different? And it's like the body itself places limits on what we can responsibly say. People are much more kind of tuned into and concerned that you can't just say, oh, isn't intersex great? You have to actually realize that, you know, Johns Hopkins medical school was dealing with infants who were terribly sick and who were going to die if they didn't, you know, if horrible interventions weren't made on their bodies. I mean, I just feel like somehow sort of people have begun to look at the way the body itself limits things, and then also much more about the way in which the kind of micro-political experience of living in a medieval city and all of the different ways people could, you know, make decisions whether they were going to come across your doorstep or not. That's the kind of politics that is really kind of shaping what's going on here.
I just would add, it's not just a broad market. physicians want to connect to the highest, richest, most
Yes.
aristocratic, and that
Also.
just makes them, and Arnaud Villanova, we know many of the great theoreticians, even today, Alzarate ends his life as a very, very wealthy man, huge amounts of property. So, it's not just to have hundreds of patients, it's to have the 2 or 3. And they are actually appointed physician to the family, and that means men and women. I mean, goodness gracious,
Yes.
women get as sick as men do. And I was reading McGraw, recently reading McGraw, and he really, he doesn't have enough information to actually declare that men were routinely touching women and touching them in their private places. But he has 3 or 4 texts where this is really clear. And I think that the text that you cited, where you call the midwife when the woman will not let, she just is too embarrassed to let
Yeah.
you work on her. But I don't think that that's a general case. I think that's also, that may be, I don't know what
It
percentage.
depends on the family. It
But
depends
absolutely, it depends on the culture they come from. It
Yep.
depends on, so, anyway, they want.
Yeah, I don't think in Northern Europe women were nearly as hinky about it. So there's lots
Yeah.
There's
Oh,
lots
absolutely.
of variation in it. Oh, and I remember you asked a question about law and legal cases. Well, I was just reading, there's 2 scholars who have found a legal case concerning a hermaphrodite, i.e. sort of someone they identify as intersex. It's from the 1330s, 20s in Florence. And it's this fascinating thing about they have to figure out if this person is male or female. It's a aristocratic family. He's the oldest son, if he's a son. It simply has to be decided. It is not. There is no way. That is to say, not to decide is to decide. And something I was reading about legal cases. I can't remember elsewhere. Was in that. It was actually about legal cases somewhere in the Abbasid Empire. I'll think of it at some point. But I think, again, it's about families. It's about families, it's about cities, it's about inheritance, it's about money. It's, it's not really about the state in this period.
Yes.
Hi, yeah. Donna Villac, part of the Making and Knowing project here at Columbia. I also think it's very much about firewalls as well, just linking back to what you were talking about, and intellectual ideologies. I'm really struck by 2 of the images that you showed in your talk. One was from it was English 14th century, of the woman with these 7 partitions within her uterus, and then, of course, Vesalius. They're separated by a couple of centuries, a couple of generations, a handful of generations, but they're so ideologically distinct. And I was really struck by an alchemical interface that you can read into the 14th century image in terms of contemporary images that detail the tree of life through the distillate apparatus, which also points to the 7 days of creation. The number 7 here, I think, is absolutely seminal.
So to speak.
Pardon the pun. But also, it's absolutely scholastic in its iconography, the 14th century image that you showed. And the Vesalius, for me, is a wonderful analog to philology. It's a type of anatomical philology that I think is absolutely, you can read it in parallel to what is happening textually. And this may seem sort of like a weird non sequitur, but in my mental realm it's not. When you look at Arcimboldo's representation of Rudolph II's autumnus. The fruits and vegetables in which the emperor is comprised of is absolutely accroché. It reads as an anatomy. It reads as the body plane. And I think that these two images that you showed, there's a really interesting interplay in terms of what the shift is between these two periods, which is, again, only a couple of centuries, which I find astonishing and astounding, and sort of rips off of what your earlier point was. What is change? Where does it happen? How do we identify it? But I think somehow, in some way, in this period, that maybe we can bracket off somewhat artificially, apropos the two images you showed, change has happened. Something really distinct is taking place here. A big shift.
Yep. No, I agree with that, and I'm very interested in the alchemical thing because it makes perfect sense that there would be an alchemical element to it. I don't know, what kind of vessel that would be like, but obviously it must be like something.
Well, perhaps to be continued.
Yes, exactly. Well, I'm very interested in the whole issue of how do you make a positive story out of this, because I'm not interested in just going after Laqueur. I think that's a lot of why nobody has really done it. It's like that's so mean. It's so boring and mean-spirited. On the other hand,
there's no doubt that, no one's denying that there's a change around 1800 and 1700 and 1600 and 1500 and in between that changes occur. It's that here's an historian who actually created an argument that depends on the verifiability of a big and mistaken thesis. A thesis that could be overturned in 20 different ways. So you can either say, well, that's not important. It's really what's important is what he's saying is happening at the moment, and that may be, but history doesn't work that way. History actually has to depend on what, if you're actually making an argument that this is based in medical theory and this is based in Galenism and this is the way it was for all time until then, this flattening is really what is extremely disturbing, especially to a medievalist or an Arabist or those cultures that completely jumped over and just kind of get lumped. So, I am speaking. Mine comes very much from my personal reaction to what I see when I see this happen. It's really quite annoying. Start with what you can tell. Start with what you see. Start with what you can show. And stop trying to pump up your own argument with false history.
Maybe one last question? Or two? Let's take two.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. There were three questions. We'll take the questions and then we'll have answers. So let me start.
So I've been waiting for someone to ask the orgasm question. No one has, so I will. So in terms of the positive story that you might be able to tell, where would the history of sexuality come in?
Yeah.
The Archimedean point from which Laqueur spoke included a kind of utopian vision of the past in which sexuality had been freer, women had orgasms, all of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what are the implications for the history of sexuality of this vision?
Okay. We'll take the other two questions. Please.
I'm not asking a question. I'm a historian of 19th and 20th century India, and it's interesting for me to think of this because I think in some ways, at least from the India perspective, we think Laqueur and we think, oh, how great it is that Europeanists have worked through the question of sexual difference and sex difference in science. Because there's literally no scholarship, very little scholarship on Ayurveda or yogic or tantric structures of what sex difference is in science. What's interesting for me is that I think in that sense, the import of your argument has significance. This is more of a comment. Because there's a difference, because there's a heightened circulation of texts, particularly in the 18th century. And the question of whether one sex or two sex is highly influential in terms of the way medical ideas about sexual difference circulate. And so it seems to me the timing or the temporality of what one sex was versus two sex has implications far beyond this, because it has to do with the circulation of text, particularly, with the rise of colonialism and foundation, for example. So it seems to me that there's an import there that may be broader.
Actually, this
wasn't so much a question as a comment, sort of picking up on what Joel was saying. I think, and I guess the question is, Katie, whether you'd agree with this or not, but the danger, I think, is not so much that a story is going to be based on misinterpretation of evidence, as that the persistence of asking about this story has overshadowed many other questions that we might be asking about the history of the body, the history of science, the history of medicine, so that suddenly everybody's asking about anatomy, whereas one really could ask about humoral theory, which is much more important in the Middle Ages, is extremely interesting, is not the way people argue later, but which allows for a certain lability, it allows for metamorphosis and resistance there too. In other words, if one wasn't spending all one's time asking about Laqueur, one would be asking about a whole range of other questions. So maybe the danger, this is, as I say, really just a comment or something to pick up on or not, maybe the danger is not so much whether one's writing positive or negative history about one particular thread, but that it's keeping people from looking at other threads which might, in the long run, give us a better big picture for the period.
However, I think the appeal of anatomy is it's scientific.
Oh, I think it's visual also.
Oh, and it's
I mean, it's very, I mean, I wanted to ask you that question.
Yeah.
Later, yeah.
But also there's a kind of teleology built into the story of modernity that you're, in a way, kind of trying to argue against, which is something that you might try and consider as well. Right? So you're looking at the rise of particular disciplines of knowledge and sort of expert knowledge that comes out of the attempt by certain surgeons to then make claims on ancient or classical texts. And so it seems like that process of contextualization is something that you could also do when dealing with other historians, and that might be one way, for instance, to take into account what Laqueur was doing, you know, in the way that was suggested in the discussion today as well, just in terms of, you were saying as well, just in terms of thinking about the culture of the 1970s and thinking about the rise of the body and thinking about arguments against the medical establishment that encompassed some of these issues that were very contextual and timely, and therefore kind of give, I think, impetus to those forms of recovery. So how is it that you can imagine from the 2nd century to the 18th century a continuous story that is a claim? Historical change happens at all moments, right? Any 2 points in time, there's a change. So it's the question of which forms of change we focus on. That's history.
Yeah. So. Yep, I think that's absolutely right. And I should say, if we know so much about this topic now, it's because of Laqueur. I mean, to be, you know, I don't think any of us would have done all of this work. So, I mean, he has produced, I mean, he's done a great service. I don't know if he's done an equally great service to 18th, 19th, and 20th century history as he has to pre-modern, but he really, you know, we got a wiggle on when we read that book. Debbie, history of sexuality, I think that's a really interesting question. I think both of these, I had not thought about the circulation of knowledge issue, and that's fascinating and a really interesting question. The other thing, history of sexuality, I mean, there again, I think we end up with, you know, when we're looking at Arabic materials, it's really different than Latin materials, and that's one of the things. I don't think it's any coincidence that it's a Christian tradition that constantly is trying to edge out female seed, because a Christian tradition, you know, in that tradition, women's orgasms are not important. And I mean, it's so complicated, but where that's coming from is actually Ibn Rushd, who was a sort of a hardline Aristotelian 12th century Muslim writer in Spain, who was not particularly influential in the Arabic tradition, but he was wildly influential in Western Europe. And, you know, he was very much sort of this notion of female passivity. So I think that the orgasm thing immediately also gets you into looking at a broader cultural realm. But I haven't really thought it through. I have one question, which is it possible even ever to tell an interesting big story? Or are all big stories, do they end up being stupid? You know, like The Swerve, or like this.
No, I really hope the answer to that question is.
Well, I think that's a wonderful subject for next year, Trilling. Meanwhile, thank you very much, Professor Park.